I might be biased, but we might not go to church, but we come to chapel, right? Where on Sunday, we try to be in and out in 45 minutes because brunch awaits. And so do naps.
Chicken and waffles.
Await. You don't have to leave your critical thinking skills when you come into God's house, because if anyone needs to be thinking critically, it should be people of faith.
What am I saying? At some point, we have to understand and have a common definition of what faith is. We all have our perspectives, we all have our understandings, but when we get into a room together, all we do is talk at each other. We don't ever listen.
When we talk about sexuality and spirituality, some spiritual belief systems are designed to oppress sexuality, and usually women's sexuality.
Our Black non-believers, we gather together. We talk about politics, we talk about race issues. So the church doesn't own that. So it's okay for us to be leaving and seeking other spaces.
That being said, I do think that I understood myself more as a religious being than a spiritual one for most of my upbringing, just understanding the do's and don'ts. And I think that actually may connect to some of the issues that we see with why people are leaving. When it just becomes a to-do list or a to-don't list, that becomes really constricting and limiting for people trying to explore their sense of why they are the way they are and what that means and what our essential purpose is.
If we are not honest, if churches are not honest, and I do believe that even the pastors who, if you are a pastor and you didn't do any of this stuff, you bear a lot of the responsibility and the burden to say, look, I represent a brotherhood. I represent some folks that did some dirty and are still doing some dirty stuff. On behalf of us, I apologize.
I think institutions die when they get caught up with the obsession of self-preservation.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the definition of death. I preach tomorrow morning, not today, but if you seek to save your life, you will lose it. But if you give your life over to something, Jesus had some good stuff. You should
really
try. If you give your life over to something larger than yourself,
Yeah.
whether you are a person or an institution, you'll discover your life.
And so I really couldn't be in church until I could find spaces that said, whoever you are, you can be here. And then once I was there, then it was like, okay, we're in a relationship. It's clear you love me. Tell me about your God. All right, let me hear about this Jesus, and all of that. And then could go in there, and it's still a fight.
Why do we all have to wear white? Why do I have to put this band around my arm? And when they keep getting met with, because that's how it's always been done, they're like, I'm out, because we're not an ignorant generation. Give me specific answers, and then I'll rock with you a little bit more.
It really tripped me out when I realized that people who are old enough to be my great-grandmother trusted me all because I had Reverend in front of my name.
Right.
That blows my mind, and I recognize I have a great responsibility with that.
That's
so
right.
I can't just say anything, because guess what? There is gonna be that person that's gonna hang on my word just because I'm a reverend.
It's raising the question now that we've never asked before. And the question is okay, church, make your case. The church never needed to make a case. You went because it was the only show in town. Where else you gonna go? If you was Baptist, you went to First Baptist. That was it. The second church was called Second Baptist. No case needed to be made.
If we are not honest, if churches are not honest, and I do believe that even the pastors who, if you are a pastor and you didn't do any of this stuff, you bear a lot of the responsibility and the burden to say, look, I represent a brotherhood. I represent some folks that did some dirty and are still doing some dirty stuff. On behalf of us, I apologize.
You kind of went with the motions because that was what was expected of you. Was you get up, you go to church, you serve on the usher board, you do this as planned, but I don't know that it necessarily connected with me till I was grown.
We are not the same. We are radically different, and that's beautiful. We don't need to try to wipe away that difference with faith. We need to try to use our faith to faithfully understand and wrestle with that difference before we kill each other. Because that's what's happening on the news every day. They're just saying, hey, just kill each other. You know what you should do, right? Just join the right side and hate the other side. You know, and faith can give us an opportunity to do something different, but this moment has raised that question for the first time.
And I know that when the pastor fails and the deacon fails and the mother fails, gospel music holds us together.
And I was about 3 or 4 years old. My mother evacuated our apartment because he was in the bathroom about to kill himself. And she took me and my siblings out the house. We went next door to the neighbors, and she told my father that if he didn't get his life together, she was gonna leave him. So for most street dudes, getting your life together don't mean go to therapy. It means go to church.
And so I think for me, I always knew that there was a spiritual identity there. But what the seed of me becoming a mystic, a churchy mystic, Buddhist, spiritualist, witchy, humanist, conglomeration of all of the things.
All of it.
I think that for me didn't come until I was older, until I had some experiences. So do I wish that it would have come earlier or later? No, not really, because I think for me, all of those things were seeds of the divine, and it was up to me to listen and be really tuned in to, okay, what is sacred for me? What is sacred to me? And what is sacred in the communities that I serve, which are queer, trans, people of color, and Black people?
Very strategically maneuver through this world. If a brother comes up to us and asks us for our name and our telephone number and we don't want to give it to him, we don't even know if we're going to come out of that exchange alive, right? So there are so many other forces that practically beat us down every single day. And then you want to tell me that I can't experience the one thing, intimacy, that will literally allow me to remember that I am human and remember that I am loved and worthy of love.
Part of my transformation was to realize that, hey, the Holy Spirit is a feminine entity for me. God is a woman. God can be feminine. Mothers are goddesses, and just really embracing different terms and looking to, for instance, African spirituality and Ifa, and to see different Orishas that are women, and these divine entities have feminine energy, and that was a big transformation for me.
One thing I like about the SGI USA, we have different auxiliary groups that include people of different culture, gender, sexuality, different language. So it's all inclusive because we're all human at the end of the day.
I would like to say, first of all, I really hope there is hope for the church, because I'm a pastor.
The generation of gospel radio is not us, right? It's mama, it's grandma. And so they're fighting with us about what we're trying to do, like have these kind of conversations.
Look, I have a real problem with pastors pandering to women's insecurities.
Yes.
Correct. To try to use that as a way to get praise. I just have a real issue with that. I don't like that it's preached that a man is your ultimate reward.
Correct.
Do this and you're gonna get a man.
And I've never really felt safe in those spaces. A lot of times it's because of predatorial energy. It's because of the judgment that you can literally see seeping off of people's faces for various number of reasons. And just a true feeling of not being fully accepted. Like you said earlier, if I can't come in here as my full self, then that makes me uncomfortable. That makes me feel unsafe. If I know that your perspective is this thing about me as a person, that makes me feel unsafe, because I don't know how you respond if you are maybe offended by me or what have you.
I feel like the process of spiritual awakening is not one defining point. It's something that is constantly evolving, particularly when you decide to answer the question of who am I? Who is God to me and who is God for me?
Like, church is brunch, church is shade rooms, church is IG, church is Twitter, church is Black Twitter, but also church is your therapist. Because if we really want to have this conversation, and I don't know if we really are, my newest pastor is my therapist. Because for much of my time within the religious confines that I found myself in, my church couldn't resolve the childhood trauma that I had. The formative trauma, things you can't just pray away. we actually might get to the root of what we've really been praying about all along.
Good evening. My name is Eric Williams, and I'm the curator of religion in the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Tonight, we broadcast live from the Reginald F. Lewis Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. And on behalf of the leadership of the museum and our center, the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life, we welcome you to another exciting installation of our God Talk series. Tonight's series, God Talk 2.0, digital #Black Faith, promises to be an exciting, engaging, and provocative dialogue from representatives from different generations. As you know, Black millennials represent perhaps the most understudied and creative sector of Black religious life. Black millennials have much to teach the larger tradition of Black religion about navigating religion in digital spaces. And so tonight, let us lean in, let us engage, and let us learn as we experience together God Talk 2.0.
Good evening and welcome to God Talk 2.0. We are live tonight from the Reginald F. Lewis Museum in Baltimore, Maryland, just a short drive from our home in Washington, D.C. My name is Krystal Lee, and I will be your social media correspondent for tonight. This is my third God Talk panel, and I can promise you, you do not want to miss a moment of this. God Talk 2.0 is presented by the National Museum of African American History and Culture in association with the Pew Research Center and made possible by the Lilly Endowment Fund. God Talk 2.0 is an intergenerational conversation around Black religion and spirituality in the digital age. Please join the conversation on the museum's social media channels at NMAAHC on Twitter and on Facebook, and use the hashtag GodTalk and the hashtag BlackFaith. Tonight's host, the dynamic Teddy Reeves, is the museum's specialist of religion. He holds a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and an ABA in English from Hampton University. As he moderates tonight's conversation with an amazing lineup of panelists, we ask that you lean in and learn with us. The National Museum of African American History and Culture presents God Talk 2.0, featuring Dr. Kiana Cox, Willie Moore Jr., Angelica Lindsey Ali, Jibreel Salam, Dr. Carrie Kholi-Murchison, Tina Lifford, Reverend Dr. Erika Gault, Reverend Dr. Melva Sampson, Jynnette Lewis, Mandisa Thomas, Rabbi Sandra Lawson, OSHUN, Krystal Lee, and your host for the evening, Teddy Reeves. And now your host, Mr. Teddy Reeves.
Thank you, Krystal. Good evening and welcome to God Talk 2.0, Digital Black Faith. I'm your host, Teddy Reeves. Over the past 2 years, the National Museum of African American History and Culture's Center for the Study of African American Religious Life, in association with the Pew Research Center, has embarked upon a journey of discovering how Black millennials are choosing to engage with faith, spirituality in the 21st century. Tonight, we take that conversation a little further to better understand intergenerationally how Black religion is shifting in the digital realm. To follow the conversation, we invite you to at the museum, that's NMAAHC, or use the hashtag Black Faith or God Talk to put your questions forth to our panelists a little later in the show or to follow along with the conversation. I am so excited about this conversation tonight, and I am ready to jump in to talk to these amazing panelists. Let's begin by introducing our panelists for this evening. Our first panelist for this evening is Dr. Kiana Cox. Dr. Kiana Cox is a research associate at the Pew Research Center, where she works on the center's domestic polling about religion. Next, we have Reverend Dr. Melva Sampson. She is the Assistant Professor of Preaching and Practical Theology at Wake Forest University School of Divinity, and she's the creator and curator of Pink Robe Chronicles, a digital hush harbor that centers faith and spirituality. Rabbi Sandra Lawson is the Associate Chaplain at Elon University in Elon, North Carolina. Rabbi Lawson is the world's first openly gay, Black, and female rabbi. She is a top rabbi on social media and is affectionately known as the Snapchat Rabbi. Mandisa Thomas is the founder and president of Black Nonbelievers Incorporated. Mandisa encourages more Blacks to come out and stand strong with their non-belief in the face of such strong religious overtones. Reverend Dr. Erika Gault is the Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Arizona. She's currently working on her first book project titled No Matter What They Think of Me, Black Millennials, Hip Hop, and the New Black Church, and co-edited volume entitled You're Gonna Learn Today, The Aesthetics of Christians in Hip Hop. Last but not least, we have Jynnette Lewis, who is an oracle and spiritual life coach. She provides services through intuitive astrology, divination through tarot, skill development, and training through her 6-month Light Worker Incubator course. I am so excited to be with you all tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for taking out the time. You are all over the place. We have Elon, we have Arizona, we have Atlanta, we have Winston-Salem, North Carolina, my hometown, Los Angeles, and DC. So let's jump right into the conversation. Are you ladies ready? So my first question for tonight, and I'm going to start with Kiana this evening. What is the current state of Black religious participation in organized faith traditions, and what does that mean?
Sure, thank you, Teddy. In order to talk about Black religious participation in the United States, I want to give a little bit in terms of the lay of the land. In 2014, we conducted our religious landscape study. It's one of the largest religious studies of religion that we do on adults in the United States. That study is comprised of about 35,000 adults who are in the United States. And so what we know from that study is that about 80% of Black Americans were Christian. And as of 2014, this is slightly higher than the share of all Americans who were Christian in 2014, about the same as Hispanics, but also higher than Asians and whites. So what we know from looking at that racial breakdown of religiosity in the United States is that Black Americans are among the most Christian demographic in the country.
So what's happening, and I'm going to come back to you, Kiana, what is happening with the rise of Black people, particularly millennials and younger, in their disaffiliation from mainline religious traditions? Where, if anywhere, do we know if they're going? Where are they going?
Yes, and so one thing that I think is really important to understand in terms of people being unaffiliated with religion is that is not just a Black trend, it's not just a trend among Black people, and it's not just a trend among millennials. What we see is that over the last 10 years, from about 2009 to 2019, for African Americans, for Hispanics, for whites, and for the general public overall, we see about a 10% decline in the percentage of people who actually identify as Christian. So, for example, African Americans were about 80% Christian. 2009, but by 2019, there were about 70% Christian. And again, that same 10% gap for most groups in the United States. So yes, millennials are less likely to be religious and less likely to be Christian, but again, and as you say, disaffiliating from religion is not unique to them. It's something that we're seeing in the country overall.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much. And my last question, and before we open it up to the panelists, the other panelists, what is the current trend of social media usage among Black Americans?
Sure. When we look at our data in terms of social media, what we see in terms of social media usage is that about 80% of adults in the United States overall use social media. We look at African Americans, that number is about 70%. So still, by and large, African Americans are on social media. The majority of African Americans are on social media. And if we look at the particular platforms that people use, Facebook is the most common platform, and not just Black Americans, but most Americans are on by far. Across ages, across races, Facebook remains the most popular social media platform that the United States. The only sort of caveat that we see that is that for people under 30, they're almost as likely to use Snapchat as they are to use Facebook. But again, what we know from our data is that Facebook, pretty much by far, is the most popular platform in terms of social media usage. One other thing that I think is really interesting that we see from our data this year is that Black Americans are most likely to use social media for social justice causes. So about half of Black people are likely to use social media in order to post pictures about issues that are important to them, in order to find out information about protests and rallies. They're also likely to use social media in order to gather people together in order to talk about causes that are important to them. So what we see is that Facebook is the most common instrument that people use, but that Black Americans are also more likely than other races to use social media for causes that are important to them.
Wow, thank you so much, Kiana. That leads us really into this next question for all the panelists. Who are the leaders and the current occupants of Black digital, religious, and spiritual spaces? Has it changed post-COVID-19? If it has, who are the new agents entering into the digital realm? Don't all jump in at once.
Black women. Black women. In every way, shape, and or form. I'm reminded of Dr. Cheryl Townsend Jilk's book, If It Wasn't for the Women. I mean, pre-COVID, Black women were already in the digital trenches. Black women have always been in the spiritual trenches using, as Dr. Erika Gault would say, their spiritual technologies. And so Black women have remained at the forefront in doing this particular type of work.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, good evening. I would add to what my dear sister, Dr. Sampson has said, are those who have been marginalized, those who have been ostracized from our traditional religious institutions and already began making a home on the internet pre-COVID. They've been the leaders and have benefited greatly in expanding their audience because of that during this time.
If you could quickly repeat the question, that would be great.
Yes, Mandisa. Who are the leaders and current occupants of Black digital, religious, and spiritual spaces? Has it changed post-COVID-19? If it has, who are the new agents entering into the digital realm?
Yes, so if I may, I will say that Black atheists, humanists, and non-believers have been the leaders in this space and change, because we had been already creating and developing those spaces online, especially for those closeted non-believers who cannot express their views to their families. And so I would say that the religious community is actually playing catch up during the COVID era because they've had to adapt. And while that has been, that is a good thing, those of us who have already been on the forefront of utilizing either social media or the other technological platforms have already had an edge on this. And those who are innovative, those who have been able to think ahead in our communities, we're the ones who are leading this charge.
Jynnette, I saw you were saying something. Do you have a response?
We're looking forward to expanding and creating a greater network of those who exist in a more religious space so that we can bridge the needs of the people who are wanting to incorporate both religious as well as traditional lineage practices for their spiritual development.
Dr. Sampson, I believe there's been a bit of a delay, but if you could, Jynnette, thank you so much. I heard your comment. Dr. Sampson, if you could repeat your most recent comment you made.
I was just agreeing with Mandisa, pointing out that what the digital age and what sort of this moment that we find ourselves in allows for is for people to bypass these traditional processes of legitimation, particularly as I speak from the perspective, the social location as an African-centered womanist, spiritually fluid Christian, which is a mouthful, which some may feel like, what is that, right? But it is the way that I'm able to name myself and claim and stand in digital space where I do not have to move through boards or processes, although I am credentialed, in ways that would always have me sort of backpedaling or looking for space or looking for opening. And so what I'm suggesting is that the people who are leading this particular movement are the people who do have vision, are the people who have traditionally been left out and who have been locked down and who have been pushed out or beyond the borders of traditional religion because of respectability and so many other issues, that what this does is level the playing field.
So I'm going to pose this next question. And again, I know there may be a bit of a sound delay for you all, but kind of piggybacking off of that, how do we see digital Black theology creating space or making room for previous generations? Do you see it as inclusive space? And does inclusivity matter?
Black theology, I see a shift where it is starting to be a bit more inclusive, but not to the point where it is the more inclusive of humanists and atheists and secularists perspectives and also the activism. It's still sort of slow within our communities, and this is a challenge because we also have to consider the traditions within our community and the role that the church has played. And not often has it been to our benefit, especially to Black women. So while I do see that there are some good efforts, we still have a long way to go, if I do say so, from my position as representing the atheist humanist perspective.
Dr. Gault, I heard you making your comment.
I would say in digital settings, it has offered many participants the autonomy to create their own theology, to take fragments of other bits of theology that they've learned along the way or that they see as they walk along the digital space. And that does have a lot to do with both seeking and creating inclusivity.
I do think that for this question, there actually has to be a willingness to be inclusive.
Essentially, what I'm suggesting here is that theology, God talk, has always had space and always had place, and has at its core been inclusive, at least from my perspective, where Black women, Black people, marginalized people's lived experiences with struggle, with resistance have always been at the center. And so the issue really has been not whether it's been inclusive, it's been how has it been interpreted and by whom has it been interpreted. And what digital space space does now is bust those parameters wide open so that these generational gaps that have existed can merge in a way where folk can really hear one another. I think what it also does, it allows people, if you will, to come out of proverbial types of closets, proverbial types of theological closets, wherein folk have not always believed what they've heard. And again, I'm speaking from a particular context, what they've heard their faith leaders preach. They have always been spiritually fluid, particularly in Black communities. They have always done a little bit of this and a little bit of that. They have always sought their religious leaders at the same time, seeking the traditions that have been passed down to them. And so what this digital age does is allow folks to come out and be free and be theologically expansive and technologically savvy.
Thank you, Dr. Sampson.
If I may interject there, I would have to disagree slightly because even with that fluidity of thought and theology, there is still a fundamental principle and fundamental principles of the subjugation that has been committed against particularly our community. And so it appears that even though there may be, for example, more women that are leading, there are still some very, very patriarchal principles that encourage subjugation. And so this causes confusion for a lot of folks. And so we see here now a lot of people just questioning and also doing away with it altogether. And the theology must come to terms with the fact that there are some, and there must be space for those who let it go altogether and who impart science and evidence-based and verifiable premises and humanistic principles to life that is inclusive of everyone, that we're not just rebranding the same stuff that was used to oppress us. And so this is the space, yes, sure, there's a lot of space in that to, to reflect and also educate ourselves better, but we must be honest. We must continue to be honest about how sometimes we're carrying on traditions that may ultimately fail our communities in the future.
Can I hear from Rabbi? I know she's been trying to get something in. Rabbi Sandra.
I'm having trouble hearing. There's a lot of background noise, and I need you to finish the question that you asked a moment ago.
Yes. How do you see digital Black theology creating space, making room for previous generations? Do you see it as inclusive space? Does inclusivity matter?
Yes, I do see it in inclusive space. The day of building a synagogue or a church and expecting people to come to us is over. Synagogues, and we still need those. But the digital era is helping us to see that we need to interact with the public. I'm someone who spends a lot of time on social media, helping young people engage with Judaism in ways that work for them.
That's good. Jynnette? Jynnette, did you have something?
So I would say that there's potential for exclusivity to be there, but as I was mentioning earlier before we got cut off, there has to be a willingness. And I think this is going to be speaking more so to the generational divide. The youth and those on the margins are always more willing to be open to new thought, be open to new ways of doing things. And those who would be part of more of the establishment or older generation are less open to that in general. So I think that there is more of a burden on those who would exist in more traditional spaces to sit in a space of being more open and willing to think about these ideas of inclusivity and what that means, and being willing to stretch outside of their comfort zones.
Thank you so much. I know, again, we're having a bit of a delay, but as Dr. Sampson said, this is digital Black theology.
Thinking about the internet, this is a kind of mixed bag. It is the best and worst of both worlds. And some of that is just the way the internet itself is structured. The internet is an anti-Black space by design. It was meant to be antithetical to Black freedom ways. And yet we find that there are several Black folks who are making a way out of no way, who are making a space of freedom on the internet. That is really quite in keeping with our history. Black folks are the first internet. We've been establishing networks through the grapevine and figuring out how to make technologies even out of our own bodies. So it's no wonder that we interrupt the digital space in these very creative ways and figure out how to build spaces of inclusivity. But we are ever mindful of the fact that that is hard work and it's an uphill battle in order to do that, given the digital space that we're doing it in.
Yes, 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 yes. Listen, Black folk have not always been digital, but Black folk have always been networked. Be it good, bad, indifferent. And by networked, what I mean is we have always worked in community. We have always worked toward, maybe not worked in, but worked toward community. And so I'm not attempting to romanticize Black folk, Black culture, or even digital space. But what I am suggesting is that the ways in which these innovations are coming to pass are not new, right? Not new in the sense, just as Erika just said, that Black folk have always had to reach in, speak from, embody different texts, particularly when those texts have been their bodies, right? And I'm not indifferent or I don't disagree with what Mandisa said. I agree that we absolutely cannot take the same warmed over, problematic, white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalistic, misogynistic, homophobic, sexist, ableist, so forth and so on, theological precepts into digital space and call it freedom. That's not it, right? Those are leftovers. What I am contending though is I'm actually speaking against that, saying that what, at least in my work, what theologically progressive folk are doing, and again, from my lens, Black women are doing, are expanding those categories, are challenging those notions, and are making anew, or at least if they're not making anew, indeed they are maybe engaging in a Sankofa moment, reaching back to get what was lost, not from what was lost of what was problematic, but reaching back to get who we have been, who we can be, for the purpose of Ubuntu, so that we are because the other is.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to piggyback off of this question and start by posing this question to Jynnette, and then I'll move around. Jynnette, based off of what Dr. Sampson, Mandisa, Rabbi Sandra, and everyone's really been talking about, can or are digital Black religious and spiritual spaces, are they harmful? How are you each adjusting or contending with the harm that's being done in digital space as you all break new ground, right? And this piggybacks on the conversation. So I'll start with you, Jynnette.
A lot of this comes through in what I see in terms of people abusing their spiritual power and still embodying this Western Christian view of assigning your direct spiritual connection to the divine through an individual person. And so a lot of what my work tends to be is to get people back to a place of self-empowerment for that for themselves, so that they can shift the balance of power. And so a lot of that harm that comes through is people who, lose a lot of trust, who don't have a sense of their own intuition, their own sense of what is appropriate and what's not appropriate because it's been skewed.
Dr. Gault, do you have a response?
Yes, I would add to that. We often look at the harm, it is no doubt harmful, but we often look at the harms that are created on the platform instead of the danger that is the platform itself. And as I said, the fact that the internet itself is an anti-Black space. Tara McPherson talks about the lenticular logic of the internet itself that is meant to move us away from thinking about color altogether, to give us a kind of idea of the digital space as this universal or all-knowing kind of entity, when it is very much steeped in heteropatriarchal and racist kinds of notions about Black bodies, even in its theory, in the way that it has been designed. So we can look at what Ice Cube said on Facebook or on YouTube, but I think much more dangerous is what Facebook has created through the person of Mark Zuckerberg and the dangerous space that Facebook has. How do platforms become safe for folks like Donald Trump? Why did it take so long for Twitter to finally censor him? How did an organization like Boogaloo emerge through the platform of Facebook? We have to ask ourselves some questions about the structure of racism and sexism and homophobia that is really weaved into the digital space itself.
Rabbi, I saw your head shaking. Do you have a response?
I do. I was one of the reasons my head was shaking is that digital platforms do need to clean themselves up. They have been so focused on growth and not paying attention to the nastiness that comes out on these platforms. They need to definitely do a better job. I also am someone who I get it everywhere. I get homophobic messages sent to me. I get anti-Semitic messages sent to me, and I get racist messages sent to me. And I don't actually engage with them. If I'm talking about my own personal experience, I just put it out there, but I don't actually engage with hateful rhetoric. And the block feature is very powerful.
So in my work at Black Nonbelievers, we're dealing with we're dealing with a lot of people in spaces that may have left religion and the God concept and the church behind, but they're still carrying a lot of dogma and also the sexism, misogyny, and patriarchy that comes along with it. And so while the platforms themselves, in the structural sense, can often be fodder to the flames, it is up to us as leaders and organizers to manage it. And that is what we help, and that is what we try to do in our space. And there are many people who are still recovering from many forms of trauma that come along with religion. So we make our spaces places to heal, but also to learn. And it's also up to us to manage them the same way we would any other process. And sometimes we have to tell people, look, you may be able to do this in one group or one forum, but you cannot do this here. And unfortunately, for some, it may be antithetical to this idea of unity, especially a Black unity, but we still have to manage it. We have to look at this as our business and our place to help people thrive. And so that we can start overcome, because as the other panelists said, we've made this way out of no way. We've had to do this in our own ways, especially, again, for those of us who are going against the grain of what is supposed to represent the Black community. And so while, many of, especially the theological spaces, can still, they can still foster that. And certainly there are other spaces that do as well. It is up to us to manage that process.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I wanted to move as our time is winding down for this panel. The hour goes really fast. And Kiana, I welcome you to come in and chime in on this one. A segment of traditional Black religious spaces were not prepared for the technological age and implemented minimum requirements to engage their congregations. When physical services resumed, as some have, how can these entities level up to engage more diverse audiences in the digital age? So thinking about COVID-19, as many of these religious institutions and spiritual institutions and organizations had to really run to digital space, but were not prepared for it. How do these organizations begin to do the work to level up? And I'll start with Kiana, and then we'll work our way around.
Yeah, well, Teddy, one of the things that we know from our data, particularly during the pandemic, so we conducted this survey in June to people were adjusting with religious services when it comes to not being able to go in person. So what we see is that Black Americans actually was the largest share of the American public to say that they watch services online or on TV. So we had about 80% of Black people who said in the month prior to the survey, again, this was June of this year, that they watched services online or on TV, and that's compared to about 30% of the rest of adults in the United States. So even though what you said in terms of there may have been some issues implementing these things, we do see that Black people are more likely to have stayed away from in-person services and opted for services that were either on TV or online.
Thank you. I welcome others to chime in. Thank you, Kiana.
Okay, so I'm part of a Facebook group. I'm blanking on the name of it. It's like, I think it's a multi-faith response to COVID. And what I witnessed at the beginning of COVID was a massive share of resources between different faith communities. And so the Jewish community had one of the first holidays to celebrate, which was Passover. Passover came at the beginning of COVID. And then once we were done, I had an imam reach out to me like, hey, sister, how did you do Passover? Because I want to figure out how to do that for my community. And the Catholic community had their holidays and so on. And what I want to just say is that I have witnessed an amazing share of resources as we all try to figure it out. And we are moving in an era where what we have accomplished now is not going away. We're just going to evolve into something better that's more accessible to everyone.
Dr. Gault, I heard you trying to respond.
Yeah, I think this goes somewhat to what already has been said. Religious organizations will have to decide whether they're willing to totally rebrand themselves coming out of COVID, whether they're totally new kind of organization altogether, servicing their community in a new way that centers technology more so, or whether pieces that they have acquired along the way, they want to take that back to their community. Say a certain platform or digital tool was particularly useful. The reality for many struggling Black churches or churches that service communities of diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, however, is probably going to be the latter, that they'll be able or have access to particular digital tools.
So from my perspective, we saw there was a sense of defiance from the religious community. There were a lot of protests about limiting their freedom, their ability to worship. And so there were many people who defied the stay-at-home orders. They also chose to ignore the safety guidelines, or they may not have been paying as much attention to what was going on, so that quite a few of their parishioners were catching, the virus unnecessarily, sadly. But what is happening now is that, again, like I said before, there is a playing of catch up to the online and digital spaces, because there has been a monopoly and a privilege that the religious community has had so long in being able to gather in person. And so this was like a shock for many of them. And unfortunately, it has had some dire consequences for organizations like ours that are smaller, that are used to smaller gatherings, but also paying attention and following the science and following the evidence and following the information. We treaded carefully. We made sure that if we were gathering at the time before all of the shutdowns, that they were small and that we were careful. And it's interesting now to see these organizations following suit, and it's good because it's it's for the greater good of humanity. Your religious freedom does not mean that you can impact the health of anyone else. And I think that now more in these communities are starting to understand that. It is also very ironic, though, to see all of these safety measures implemented through science and technology, which is what our community has always advocated for.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to ask this question, and I have about 2 more before we turn it over to our social media correspondent to get some questions from social media. This first one is Cash App, Venmo, Zelle accounts on people's social media and websites is the new modes of religious and spiritual offerings. What are the most successful models for financially sustaining digital religious practice beyond special days, beyond tithes, building funds, and offerings?
So I think one of the things that we're finding out across platforms is where one can build greater intimacy, that the platform becomes less useful than a person feeling like they have a particular connection with a religious leader or religious figure of some kind. So as figures, as religious organizations are able to build that into their engagement with their audience, they're most successful whether they're using Cash App or Venmo or any of the other various options that are available.
Thank you. Jynnette, I heard you responding.
Yeah, so I think this also ties back a bit into the previous question about the way that we can pivot in this digital space. And it's a new way of having church in general, collapsing the hierarchy of spiritual food and nourishment coming from the top down into more of a small group setting. And so this can be a cultivation of the sharing of wisdoms of other leaders within the space in, a Facebook group. You could have a Patreon situation going where you have monthly memberships happening there for money. There could be workshops and intensives for doing a deep dive on particular topics. There's a lot of different avenues for bringing in money, but I think the primary shift again from a singular way of bringing spiritual food to people to a multimodal way is the way of the future, because that collapsing of the hierarchy has to happen.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I'd like to add that this has been a prime opportunity for many organizations to transfer, any special presentations that they may have had in person and transferring to them to online, which I know, for example, my organization does. But it's also a great opportunity to use those particular ways of generating revenue to help more people who are impacted by either COVID or other issues, and so rallying them around actual things that can help has, I think, been an effective way to continue to generate revenue for organizations. We're seeing a lot of folks and leaders stepping up to actually get active and get involved in actually helping people. So again, it's incorporating those humanistic values and actually doing the things to put the work in, but also it gives the opportunity for more people to engage, whereas it may have been local before. It expands the opportunity for outreach, and so there are many people who may feel closer and may feel more compelled to support the organization in ways that they may not have before, because they may not have been there in person.
Dr. Sampson, I saw your head moving. Thank you, Mandisa.
What this does is allow for people who have been doing the labor of tilling the spiritual soil to receive, to engage in an act of reciprocity, to receive back what they have often given without anything in return except the God bless you. And so what Cash App, what Zelle, what Venmo, what Patreon does, it says that just like my male counterparts or other dominant counterparts, that the labor, that the work that I have been doing, right, deserves to be received, but deserves to be reciprocated, not in kind with prayers, but in kind with coin, right? There is a real way in which the pay gap that we look at in all other types of disciplines is very real, particularly in this discipline of spirit work, right? And so what these moments do is create other streams of necessary income, particularly for women. And again, I'm speaking from a particular social location for women that are a part of, for Black women that are a part of denominations, connectional denominations, where they are assigned to 3-point charges, churches in small rural areas with low to almost zero income, where they have to drive miles and miles between each destination for a low pay, right? So what this does, it says that when folks are posting up their Cash App or their Venmo or other platforms, and other generations or other folk are scoffing like, oh my goodness, clutching their pearls, because what is happening is people are saying that the same way that you are being fed off of this work or off of this gifting, off of this calling, off of this anointing, off of this artistry that has been gifted to me to give to you, is the same way that you need to act in reciprocity to be able to sustain me, to sustain in community. So it is taking that principle beyond the brick and mortar, because we know, as Mandisa and others have said, the traditions and even the way folk are paid in brick and mortar are not fair. So what I see this doing is allowing people to really have agency and autonomy and speak for themselves and to be able to sustain themselves while doing it.
When it comes to these revenue streams, um, people are investing in people they want to support. And so when it comes to raising any kind of money through any of these platforms, the first thing, as far as I'm concerned, is all about building relationships. And so when you build relationships with people, they want to invest in you and they want to support you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Dr. Gault, I heard you chiming in as well.
Yeah, definitely. I would just add, for those of us women folk, as Dr. Sampson and Rabbi mentions, who have waited for youth days and women days to be the speaker, and have not received compensation for that. These have presented those kinds of opportunities, but it is not just a gendered story. It is the folks who have been hanging out on the margins of traditional religious institutions that are finding a way to creatively tap into what is happening in the digital space. That is a pattern response historically. Black folks have always looked to technology. We see it in some of our earlier gospel songs. I'm thinking Jesus on the main line. Why do they have to find him on the main line? Thinking of Black folks, Royal Telephone, tapping into technology when traditional pathways have been closed to them. And we find that that's a pattern response for women and for young people and for millennials. So it makes perfect sense for us to use these kinds of things like Cash App and Venmo to do that once again in our own times.
I'm in total agreement with everything that has been said. Yeah.
Ashe. Can this COVID-19 moment be a reformation or a great neutralizer in religious and spiritual practice among Black generations? How can traditional religious spaces use this current moment to both attract, retain, and cultivate their membership or congregants? Can this moment be a great equalizer or reformation moment for Black religiosity in this country?
Absolutely. I have had people reach out to me, one woman in particular who follows me on TikTok. She has a disability. I'm not sure what a disability is. She would attend services, religious or Jewish services, live stream, but she always felt like she was missing out on something. But now, since everyone is live streaming their services, she has said that the playing field is level. The other beautiful thing about the era that we're living in is whatever images people had about religious leaders have gotten broken down. And so, in my community, the images that we see in synagogues often depict white, bearded men wearing prayer shawls and all of the stuff that Jewish men wear, when no one in the community looks like that. What I also want to add that depending on which of the three studies you looked at, 10 to 15 to 20% of the Jewish population are Jews of color. And so the social media has broken down whatever stereotypes people have about what religious leaders look like, or in my case, what Jewish leaders look like. And so we're seeing more diversity we're seeing more diversity in the Jewish community, even though the diversity has been there for a long time. And also because of everything that's happening, the Jewish community is waking up to the fact that, like the rest of our society, our Jewish communities are not equitable. And so we're trying to give more voice and create more leadership opportunities to represent the diversity, the vast diversity that's in the Jewish community. So the short thing I want to say is that this era that we're living in has created amazing opportunities for marginalized people and people who have not been seen, and now be seen because of the world we're living in. I mean, I'm on Smithsonian right now as a Black queer rabbi because of my presence on social media.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I heard Dr. Gault, and I'm going to move us along because we got some questions that are posed on social media. Dr. Gault, and I know Dr. Sampson and Mandisa, I saw all of your heads moving. So I'm going to get to you in that order. Dr. Gault.
Thank you. So I would say that when you think about the Black church as one religious institution, it has not always been that institution. And I think that's important to keep in mind because we can often move historically through its kind of genealogy and talk about it being birthed out of the conditions of slavery and in hush harbors. But we get to the present and it's like we think there's an end to that continuous transformation. So when you ask the question, can there be reformation? I sure hope so. The optimistic side of me can look back historically and say Black folks have always created futures. They have always looked at the dynamic possibilities and remade their institutions, remade those groups. And so perhaps they can do that again. In my own work, when I talk about the Black church, I don't talk about it as a brick and mortar site, but as a linguistic site that continuously is being remade through a host of things as people tap into memes and through their profiles and through their posts. They are remaking the notion of the Black church. And that's happening across religions and across religious institutions as Black folks have to delve into their creative paths and figure out how to do this thing over again. So as much as that transformation has happened in the past, I think it can and is happening right before our very eyes.
Awesome. Mandisa, and then we'll come to you, Dr. Sampson. Mandisa.
And so I see before there being a reformation, there's going to have to be a reckoning. We are reckoning the fact that many of us, even though this conversation is centered around millennials who have been abandoning traditional beliefs, we are actually now in what I would say is a life or death circumstances. And these circumstances are going to compel more people to do their research, follow the evidence, and follow the guidelines, which means that there are going to be more people who are coming to really reconsider those beliefs and how they are playing into today's times, which means that there are going to be some folks who let it go altogether. The question is the community going to be ready? Is the community going to be ready to hear, especially from more of us who are openly identifying as atheists, non-believers, those who follow the science and the evidence, and that we encourage other people to do the same, whether they still subscribe to that belief or not? There is going to be some very, very uncomfortable reflections, some very uncomfortable thoughts, and some very uncomfortable actions. But again, our community is no stranger to that. And whether or not we're ready for it is going to happen. So we have to make ourselves ready. Our community has always been diverse. Again, it has been, as many of the other panelists have said, it has been one of resilience. It has been one of triumph. And that means that you're going to hear the varied perspectives from varied leaders, especially those of us who are shedding those beliefs and actually have come to that reckoning, and how we can reform utilizing the changing information and how we can sustain and help our communities thrive. So before that, we're going to have to continue to push these conversations and see how we can work together past them.
Thank you. Dr. Sampson, I'm going to go to you, and then I know, Jynnette, you may want to respond, but before, after Dr. Sampson, we're going to turn it over to Krystal for some social media questions, and feel free, Jynnette, to start us off also responding to this. So, Dr. Sampson.
Woo! Mandisa, I hope it's okay and inappropriate for me to say preach. Listen, absolutely, right? That before we can talk about reformation or reforming and whether or not this work is equalizing, we will indeed have to have a reckoning, and I'd even say offer another word, meaning reparative, right? And I mean, I'm going to go out on a ledge and say here, particularly a type of reparation, right? A reparation to the bodies, to the physical bodies, right? And even in the spiritual sense, the ways in which our traditions, be they linguistic or be they brick and mortar, have not done right by folk, right? And that does not mean that there are not spaces and places and pieces of this tradition that for some of us we hold near and dear, but it does not mean that we do a full turn away from, right, the very traumatic, the very problematic ways in which this space has not been helpful and it has been harmful. And so, you know, it is a space and place where, if I were to be honest, as a practitioner, as one who studies this, have constantly thought about, what does this mean? Does one stay here and continue to try to make change in the midst of it? Does one walk away? And how does one do that? So all of this is a part of reformation. It is helpful for us not to operate in the schism of, or the dualistic nature of either this or that. It is continually a both and.